Hey everyone, this is Kevin from the chesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be going over the Hinrichsen Gambit, which is a pretty wild variation in not only the King's Gambit, but the Falkbeer Countergambit. I've gotten a few requests on this opening. I'm not exactly sure why. From White's perspective, I'm not sure it's the best way to attack the Falkbeer Countergambit, but I thought I would go ahead and do the video. One is the King's Gambit. If anyone has a request in the King's Gambit, I try to make those videos for sure. But also from Black's perspective, it's always good to know if your opponent's doing something weird and outside the norm, how should you attack that? So I know a lot of people really enjoy the Falkbeer Countergambit, so I thought this would be good to go over because you may see it from time to time. So the King's Gambit, the best opening in chess, starts out with pawn e4, e5, and then pawn to f4. And the Falkbeer Countergambit continues with d5. Says, I'm just going to counterattack the center of the board here. Now, usually White's going to be playing knight to f3 because that really stops the threat of the queen coming down here to h4. But the Hinrichsen Gambit says, what if we just go wild in the center and play pawn to d4? And so this is the opening that we're going to be going over today. There's four variations we're going to look at. We're going to look at this pawn here on e5 takes either the pawn here on f4 or here on d4. We are going to look at this pawn on d5 taking on e4. And lastly, we're going to look at the knight coming here to f6. More than likely, I think they're going to take one of these central pawns, but they definitely could play knight to f6. There's some interesting lines that if you were playing as Black that you could go down. So let's dive into the first variation. That is the pawn taking here on f4. And this sets up for the immediate threat of queen to h4 check. Now you can't do that right away because queen down to h4 and they just play pawn g3. This stops our threat right away. Queen has to move back here, but after the pawn takes on f4, there's an immediate threat down here on h4 that White has to deal with. Now, from White's perspective, if you run this like a computer engine, one, the computer is going to be very confused that you're playing the Hinrichsen Gambit. It doesn't have a lot of theory on it, and so it's going to recommend some ridiculous moves like pawn takes here on d5. I think that's a terrible move. Absolutely don't play that as White, because then you're just going to have to deal with queen down to h4, and how do you really deal with this? Okay, pawn to g3 doesn't make a lot of sense because pawn takes here. The next move is going to be pawn to g2, discovered attack, and then you're going to lose the rook here on h1. Okay, so maybe you play bishop to g2 to stop that, but then they just take the pawn here on h2, check, king, all things bad. It's not going very well, but the only other option instead of g3 is you play king to d2, knight to f6. This king is blocking your dark square bishop, which usually wants to come out, take this pawn here on f4. This pawn here on d5 is going to fall. The dark square bishop gets involved into the game, and it's all just bad. Just don't do this at all. So really the option you should be looking at if you're White's perspective is you need to be playing bishop takes here on f4. This stops the threat of the queen coming down here to h4 because then, yeah, you can just play pawn to g3. You still have this structure here. You are blowing up your king side of the board. You can always castle on the queen side if you wanted to, but then Black is going to be forced to retreat in this spot. So after the bishop takes here on f4, Black's typically going to just take here on e4. I think Black has a pretty good setup, but I think this is the best White can get out of this position. Usually if you give up your f-pawn in the King's Gambit, you typically want to have your e-pawn. If you don't have either of these pawns, it's going to be very difficult to hold on for a really strong game. But play may continue knight to c3, attacking the pawn. Knight to f6, as you typically see as both knights really attacking the pawn and defending the pawn. Bishop here to c4, you have to stay pretty aggressive here. Bishop d7, preparing to castle on the king's side. Knight to e2, can't come to knight to f3 where it normally would want to come to because of the pawn here. So maybe knight to e2, castle on the king's side, castle. And you can see Black is up a pawn in material. I think it's going to be difficult for White. But again, they don't have too many good options. This is not the best opening from White's perspective, but you can see it's not too difficult for Black to come up with a very good game plan against this gambit. The next variation we're going to look at is if the pawn on e5 now takes the d4 pawn. White's usually going to respond. The queen takes on d4. Both of the bishops from White can easily get involved into the game. Now they have a central queen that can be very, very difficult to deal with. We're going to look at two variations. One is the pawn taking here on e4 for Black. Now, White needs to be cautious not to go ahead and trade queens, because after the king takes, maybe knight to c3 attacking the pawn, knight to f6 defending the pawn. You can see bishop c4, the king comes back over here to e8. Black is up a pawn of material, and usually from White's perspective, in the king's gambit, you go down a pawn of material, but you still have your powerful piece in the queen, and then you launch a pretty big attack, and then hopefully you have the advantage. You're chasing your opponent's king around, you have your queen, you have a strong attack. White does not have that here. White's just down a pawn in material, and there's no clear path to go ahead and get that back. So this is not the best approach for White. Now, that does not mean that this is the correct play for Black. I think there's a better option for Black that you can put your opponent in a tougher spot, because if White plays it correctly, they could just go ahead and take the pawn here on e4. Now, both sides have no central pawns, which is kind of a weird setup in chess. But then maybe bishop to e7, knight here to c3, knight to f6 here, attacking the queen. Queen can come back. If Black wants to trade, they absolutely can. Knight to c6. Just definitely don't think this is the best approach that Black can take instead of taking this pawn here on e4. What I really like is the move knight to f6, because it's really baiting your opponent. This just sets up so easy for them to play the move e5. It attacks the knight here on f6. Okay, great. And they have a little pawn chain going right here. So this is almost an immediate move that you might see here. And Black has the really good move, knight to e4. This is a great outpost. This knight here on e4 can't be moved by a pawn on either the d or the f file. D pawn is gone, and the f pawn here on f4 is already passed. And so how does White really continue here? They can put themselves in a pretty tough spot in this position. As one example, they may play bishop here to d3 and say, okay, I have to get this out of the way, so let's go ahead and play bishop d3, attacking this knight. But that loses to bishop to c5. Now, if you start to look at the moves that the queen can go to, it can't retreat back on this d file. It can't come down this dark square diagonal. It will just lose to the bishop here. Can't take the bishop. That's protected by the knight here. The only safe square is queen over here to a4 check. Bishop to d7, attacking the queen. Queen falls back here, but then the devastating move, queen to h4 check. And you can see pawn g3, knight takes here on g3. If the pawn takes, queen takes here on h1. But then how does White really continue in this spot? You can see the light square bishop getting involved into the game if it needs to. This dark square bishop is still attacking all these dark squares here. So this is going to be a pretty tough spot. Now, if we look from White's standpoint, what are the other options to continue? Sometimes if there's an outpost, you always want to attack that pawn. So maybe pawn to c4. But same thing, bishop here to c5, attacking this queen. Queen's in a pretty tough spot here. Now, they in this spot, they can take maybe this pawn here. But then after the queen takes here on d5, the pawn takes. Now knight down to f2. This is defended by the bishop here on c5, and this rook here on h1 is going to fall. So again, White fell for the trap, and it's just so difficult to see all the threats that Black really has. Another option would be, instead of playing pawn to c4, they could play knight to f3. Same thing as before, bishop to c5, maybe queen a4, pawn c6, stopping the threat right there. Bishop to d3 maybe makes more sense from White's standpoint to try to get this knight, which is a really good outpost, away. But then pawn down to b5, attacking the queen. Queen b3, bishop here to e6, preparing for a discovered attack with a d4. Or if there's ever a capture here on e4 as well, that would also be a discovered attack on the queen here. So lots of good options from Black if they decide to allow us to have this knight here on e4. The next variation we're going to be looking at is if this d-pawn takes on e4. Extremely uncommon, but hey, thought we'd go over it just because you may see some crazy stuff if you're already playing this gambit. Now, usually from White's perspective, they're looking to give up the pawn here on f4. They usually don't get the chance to take back material and have two central pawns to their opponent's one central pawn. So they're probably just going to snap take here on e5. And the only way that black can really continue here, they can't play knight to f6 because it's being stopped by the pawn here on e5. They don't want to play knight to e7, knight to h6, and then after bishop to c4, bishop down here to g4, and this knight protects it here. But if your play really is to play knight to h6 and bishop down to g4, I think there's just so many better options for black here. Hopefully, if you're facing this as black, you've chosen a different option that we already went over here. But from here, you may see knight to e2, blocking the attack on the queen here. Knight to c6, attacking this pawn here on d4. Now, maybe pawn to c3, stopping that, or just say, you know what, we don't even care about that. Maybe knight to c3, because it doesn't matter too much. This knight here on e2 can't really defend this pawn on d4 because it is being pinned down by the bishop here on g4. So maybe queen to h4 check, pawn g3, queen comes back here, doubling up the attack on this light square diagonal here. Who knows exactly how play could continue, or could just castle. So instead of pawn to c3 or knight to c3, just castle on the king side. Maybe the bishop takes, queen takes here, queen comes down, takes the pawn here on d4 check. So a lot of variations that you could come down. Not a lot of theory in this particular variation. Don't think you'll see it too much. Instead of that last exchange with the pawn, you could actually see the knight taking here, or the knight just coming down to f6. It's a pretty interesting idea here, and it all stems from the thought of, yeah, after the pawn takes on e5, really want to get that outpost here on e4. Now, it's not as good as the setup as we saw before, but still very difficult for white to deal with. And so how do they deal with it now? They could just play knight to f3. Okay, well, we see c5 attacking this pawn here on d4. Maybe bishop to d3 attacking the knight. A little bit better now. The queen's not trapped as it was here on d4, and the bishop comes down to c5 as we saw before. So maybe knight to c6, bishop takes, pawn takes, attacking this knight here on g5. And then the pawn takes, and this puts a lot of pressure on white here. Now the knight can come take here on e4. Things get pretty complicated from here. You can see queen down to d5, preparing to get the bishops involved into the game, attacking this knight right here. How does white really continue to defend this? One idea is to play knight to d2. Can't come to c3. That's being defended by this square here on d4. So maybe knight to d2. But then knight takes here on d5, and you can see this dark square bishop is blocked off for white. Don't think it's a pretty good setup at all. Another option is to say, okay, we don't want to block off this bishop. Let's go ahead and play queen to f3 here, but then just bishop to e6. Maybe bishop out here to f4, getting it outside. Now the knight, if it wants to come to d2, it can. But then the knight can still take here, even if the bishop takes, queen takes here, castle on the king side. And white's going to have a better position. White's up a pawn in material. It has the bishop pair here. And I think going into an open-ended endgame, black's just going to have a much better game. So that is the very interesting Hinrichsen Gambit in the King's Gambit, Falkbeer Countergambit variations. From white's perspective, again, I think there's better options. If you're just having fun, which I think chess should be, you can definitely try that. But from black's perspective, I think you definitely have some good options to attack your opponent if they are going to try this. Hopefully this was helpful, entertaining for those who had maybe not heard of it before or seen it. But if you have played it, let me know what your thoughts are. If there's any other openings or any other videos you'd like me to do, let me know in the comments below. Always looking for requests, looking to add some to the wish list that I'll be making over the next few weeks and months. But thank you guys so much for watching the video. I'll see you guys next time.